So today we're going to start our last council. I think, yeah, well, it's been a while. I think this is week 13 or 14. So it's, yeah, I think that's pretty normal for us. We end up doing about three month series. But yeah, so today's the last council. We may end up having to spill this one over to 2 weeks. This may be a 2-week discussion. We'll see. We'll see how things get, how into the weeds we get. There is some difficulties with discussing this council. So the biggest difficulty we have when talking about the Second Council of Nicaea is that the original documentation has not survived very well. We've got very bad documentation from this council. So on the one hand, and a lot of this is due to the turbulent times, we're talking end of the 8th century. And so what's happening during this time? Well, in the East, you've got the Muslim invasion is in full swing. And so in the East, that means that the communication is being disrupted. And you might have monasteries that have kept records, and then those monasteries get destroyed. At the same time, speaking of the monasteries, we're also having significant power struggles in the East between the emperor and the monasteries, because both are trying to run the show, and neither one wants the other one to run the show. So again, some of our documentation is really, really bad. Now in the West, the problem we're having in the Latin-speaking world is that there has been increasing distance culturally between the East and the West at this point. And a lot of these Westerners don't know Greek anymore. And a lot of those Easterners don't know any Latin. And so we've got linguistic problems happening. And at the same time, the empire in the West is long gone, but a fellow you might know by the name of Charlemagne is trying to get it going again in a different part of the West. So this is a very turbulent time. On top of that, when we fast forward, we have major translation problems. It's been hard to get Greek versions of the Acts of this Council for centuries. Our reformers probably did not have good Greek translations. They were great at Greek, but they probably didn't have good Greek copies, for example. And the Latin copies have not always been trustworthy. They've been pretty bad. So that's been part of the problem. Once we get into English, it seems that there's some disagreements between our English translators. What do you know? Like over significant facts. Over significant facts. So in the 19th century, we get our first major one, which is in that big collection of volumes where Philip Schaff was the over-editor. I've got those 30-some volumes in my office. And the very last volume was the one on the 7 councils. And the editor was a fellow named Henry Percival. Percival's, some of his scholarship, as I've been looking at it in the last couple weeks, I'm like, this doesn't really stand. Some of that is because Percival's not unbiased. He was one of those early hardcore Anglo-Catholics, and it shows. Some of it's also that he didn't always have great sources himself in those days, right? So here's an example of that. When he's talking about the current view between East and West, what documents does he cite? The Council of Trent. That's hard to say that that's representative of anybody but one party, right? That's the Roman Catholic view, not the modern view of the undivided, or of the church, right? And when he's talking about the definition of faith in the anathemas, he bases it off of a 17th century Latin translation. In the 21st century, early 21st century, a Catholic scholar named Richard Price, he publishes the first new translation of the Acts of the Council at that time in about 150 years. Unfortunately, I didn't discover this until like Thursday of last week, so I've not had it available to me. But I did find numerous articles that quote from him extensively, and the fact is, it looks like Price and Percival do not agree on some significant facts. All of that to say is that there's some qualifications as we get into this council. Some of the information is not great, and we're going to do the best we can. And on top of that, we have ongoing disputes as Western Christians from the time of the Reformation that have not cooled down. And so again, when people's emotions get involved, it's hard to sometimes sort the facts. So all of that is to say, I've spent 5 minutes talking about this, but that's why this might be 2 weeks. We're gonna do our best here, but there may be some information that that fills out the details a bit better than what we're going to talk about in this context. Okay, so let's talk about the background to the Seventh Council. It's a controversy we call the iconoclast controversy. Now, in ancient times, at least back as far as we know, 2nd century, we have examples of this. Images of Christ and the saints were not necessarily uncommon. They weren't common, but they weren't unheard of. And they were not just in one corner of the church or by heretics or by Orthodox only. It was kind of different parts of the church did it. However, those early images were almost all ornamental and symbolic. So for example, one of the earliest ones is reworking Greek shepherd imagery for Christ as the Good Shepherd. Or very, very early images were the Magi adoring Christ. And these are not super realistic pictures. They're not, it doesn't look like they were used in worship. They were ornamental, they were symbolic. Later on, the earliest true icon we have, now there might have been some before that. The Eastern Orthodox claim that St. Luke wrote the first one, which is an absolutely absurd idea. But the earliest one we actually have is from the 6th century, and that is Christ the Judge, Christ the Teacher, not dissimilar to the one we have in the chancel. It's a very similar design to that. As things get on in the imperial church, there is a major concern over idolatry. Are these images being used in idolatrous ways? This isn't always dealt with in the same way and by all the teachers. This is a controversy that bubbles up from time to time. Sometimes some church fathers seem to be completely against all images, seeing there's too much danger for idolatry. Some of them don't mind it in certain contexts. We don't really see anything like what the Eastern Orthodox do now in terms of using icons in worship until around the 8th century, as far as I could tell. Using them in worship was not common in those first 6 or 7 centuries. That doesn't mean they were iconoclast, but the kind of thing you see with veneration it just doesn't really show up. In the 8th century, the increase of this is one of those things that start to concern certain of the authorities. In 754, so this is what, 30 some years before the council, Constantine V, the emperor, he calls a council and he forbids the use of images, period, and he orders their destruction. Why did he do this? We don't really know for sure. Some of this may have been Islam's influence. Some of it may have been that ongoing tension between the monastery and the emperors. Because who's making the images? The monks, right? They're the ones who are doing all that. We don't really know. And we end up having, but this council in 754 is not accepted in all the church. As a matter of fact, a good part of the church actively rebels against it. They're like, this is not the teaching that we believe in. And so you end up with two big parties that nowadays we call them the iconoclasts, which comes from the Greek for destroyers of images. And like one of the things they would do is they'd find these images and they'd poke out their eyes, things like that. And the other ones are the iconodules or iconophiles, and that's either respectively worshipers or lovers of images. The reasoning of the iconoclasts were that either images were completely idolatrous, vis-a-vis the second commandment, or, this is really funny, maybe they're Nestorian because in saying that this is an image of Jesus' humanity, you're separating it from his divinity. So some of them said, this is you can't have an image without being Nestorian, separating the natures of Christ to become two persons. Others said, no, they are wrong, but actually it's monophysite. You're confusing the divinity and the humanity. And it's like, okay, guys, you can't have it both ways. You can't have both extremes present at the same time. But these are the reasonings. You either got, some of them said it's idolatrous, some of them said it represents Nestorian heresy, some of them said it represented the monophysite heresy, where you don't make a distinction between the two natures in monophysitism. Now, the iconoduals, the iconophiles, their reasoning was, well, images are the books for the illiterate. Most people can't read at this time. We don't get widespread literacy for another 1,000 years or more among Christians. And so these images help teach these people the stories. And we see that today with kids' Bibles, right? I mean, that's something that we do with our children. It's not uncommon. Stained glass windows. I remember as a boy in my grandmother's church, looking at all the my Catholic grandma, all the stained glass with all the pictures of Jesus, trying to figure, okay, do I remember which story those are? In my other grandma's, my Episcopalian grandma's church, it was trying to figure out how those symbols of the different apostles relate to what I know about them. I don't know what kind of kid I was, but those were things going through my head. The other thing they said, well, and not only are the icons, the images, books for the illiterate, but also we can use them as aids to prayer. They're kind of windows into heaven. When we pray before this image of God, where we can think about God better, we can that honor we're paying to the image passes on to God. The iconoclast says that is classic idolatry, guys. That's what the pagans did. So this is the way the fight is going. So by the early 8th century, icons are very common in the East, both in churches and in private homes. And we end up getting a theologian named John of Damascus, who really becomes the most influential theologian against the iconoclast. And John of Damascus writes this. I think you have this in your handout. He says, in former times, God without body or form could in no way be represented. You can't make a picture of God because he can't be pictured. But today, since God has appeared in the flesh and lived among men, I can represent what is visible in God. What's that mean? Jesus himself, right? I don't venerate matter, but I venerate the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake, who assumed life in the flesh, and who, through matter, accomplished my salvation. So what's he saying? Pictures of Jesus are not idolatrous because you could have taken a picture of Jesus. And so I can worship Jesus without being idolatrous. And in his mind, that includes having a picture of Jesus as an aid to that worship. We end up eventually, as things go forward, getting kind of differentiating between kinds of worship theologically. There is the word in Greek latria, which is absolute worship, and that's something you can only give to God. And then there's, depending on what time period, proskunesis or doulia, which is reverence in terms of veneration, not so much worship as veneration. And they believe you can offer this to images kind of as sacramental channels of the divine energies. Okay, we're going back a couple weeks to that Eastern idea of energies that we don't really think about as Westerners. We're not going to get into the weeds on that. There's no use to doing it. But they're basically saying you can have reverence or veneration for holy things like images to use kind of quasi-sacramentally. But something that's very important about this is that according to Richard Price's account of the Acts, that distinction between latria and proskunesis is not present at the council. At the council, they discuss the issue that leads to this terminology. So they do talk about there's different kinds of worship, and there's a kind of worship that's only due to God. but the terminology doesn't come into play till later. This is one of those areas where I found myself kind of angry at Percival's account, because since he's using that later 17th century Latin as his base, he puts the Greek in there. Well, I think the Latin did put the Greek in there to make the distinction. And so I actually was corresponding with one of the people that's done scholarly work based on Price's work. I said, hey, this is what I'm claiming. He said, it has to be an insertion. Something that the Latin inserted to make the distinction, which makes sense because by then it is a distinction in terminology that's very important. But what these guys are saying is that distinction is not yet present at the Council of Nicaea, which is important when we start to talk about the controversies that come from there. So, John of Damascus kind of gives us the theological rationale behind the icono-dual position. Second Council of Nicaea is called in 787. Irene is the widow of the previous emperor Leo IV. She's kind of the regent for the new emperor because he's too young to rule, and she's the one that calls the council. And then the Patriarch of Constantinople presides. He presides over it. The Pope sent one archbishop and one abbot. That's all. The Pope of Rome. That's the only Western representation that's happened there. And it's not that the other guys couldn't come; they just weren't invited. And so it was that on the part of Patriarch of Constantinople or on the part of Pope Adrian? I don't really know. But from what I can tell, those other Western bishops just weren't invited to the party. It starts with like 50-some bishops total, which is way too little to call it ecumenical. By the end of things, though, you have about 350 bishops are present by the time they go through about a year's worth of meetings. So in the session, some significant things happen. A bunch of these Eastern bishops beg pardon for their iconoclastic approach. They beg pardon for destroying images as they start to see the reasoning that's being discussed. They discuss proofs of images being lawful from scriptures and the Father. They discuss and read those passages. And so here's some of kind of the reasoning there as far as that scripture. They said, okay, we do have the second commandment forbidding images. And if we look in context, the golden calf in context is not another god, right? It's actually, they're trying to represent Yahweh. This is the God who brought you out of Egypt, Israel. And so you see this forbidding comes in the reasoning behind the second commandment. However, you can't deny that God commands certain imagery in the temple and in the tabernacle. The cherubim, the things like that. The snake on the staff, the bronze serpent. That's another good example. And reasoning from John of Damascus, they're saying the incarnation of Christ makes it logical that you can have an image of Christ. That's their reasoning. We're going to talk about some of how that goes as we move forward. And some of the sessions, they blame iconoclasm on the approach of the Jews, the approach of the Muslims, and on this other sect called the Manichaeans. That's a Persian dualistic religion that kind of quasi-Christian that St. Augustine spent the first part of his life caught up in there. And they published this declaration of faith. The version I have is from Percival's translation, because I didn't have Price's. But here's Percival's. Just as the figure of and again, based on a Latin 17th century translation, just as the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, so also the venerable and holy images, as well in painting and mosaic as of other fit materials, should be set forth in the holy churches of God. Okay, notice that word right there, should. And on the sacred vessels and on the vestments and on hangings and in pictures both in houses and by the wayside, to wit, the figure of our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ, of our spotless Lady, the Mother of God, of the honorable angels, of all saints and all pious people. And then here's the reasoning. For by so much more frequently as they are seen in artistic representation, by so much more readily are men lifted up to the memory of their prototypes and to a longing after them, and to these should be given due salutation and honorable reverence. That's the Greek proskunesis, salutation, honorable reverence. Not indeed that true worship of faith, latria, which pertains alone to the divine nature, but to these as to the figure of the precious and life-giving cross in the book of the Gospels and other holy objects, incense and lights may be offered according to ancient and pious custom, for the honor which is paid to the image passes on to that which the image represents, and he who reveres the image reveres in it the subject represented. So that's kind of the dogma of the council. So they say it should be in churches and in houses. You should have these things, and then they give the reason why. But they do make that distinction between latria and proskunesis. Again, Price says that really what's happening is they're using proskunesis in both in the original, and it's just they're describing different kinds. So you don't get confused, but they hadn't settled the terminology yet. Then they go on to proclaim anathemas, a whole bunch of them, but among those are anathema to those who do not salute images. So if I don't reverence a picture of Jesus, however you're going to define reverence, they're saying your soul's in peril for that. And they also say anybody who sees in the way the church worships with images as being idolatrous, your soul's in peril if you think the church has been doing anything idolatrous. This is problematic, isn't it? This is a big problem. What happens with the council? Let's talk about some outcomes of the council, and then we'll talk about the substance. Probably we're going to get into that more next week, but just wanted to give you kind of this. This is the overview. In the East, this council is not accepted as an ecumenical council until the 9th century. It's fought over for about 100 years. And today, the Eastern churches see this as the close of the patristic era. This is when the period of the fathers closes, is with this council, or really with the acceptance of this council in the 9th century. It solidifies Eastern theology regarding this, something that's very important to their worship. It solidifies John of Damascus as one of the most important theologians, and it does lead to icons being the most visible aspect of Eastern Orthodox worship. How many of y'all have been in an Eastern Orthodox church? Yeah, images everywhere. Beautiful artwork in many cases. Some of the ones I've been to, I think, are a little overdone, to be honest. It kind of, for my taste, it seems a little gaudy. Some of them are more tasteful. And, you know, in some of these older churches that I've been to, more in Greece and in the Holy Land than here. I've only been to a couple here in the States. Some of those are painted on the walls. They're frescoes. Others are actual removable icons that have been, they're framed and, different styles, all that sort of thing. But yeah, that is the most visible aspect of Eastern worship. And you end up having in October a holiday in the Eastern churches, which is celebrated as the Triumph of Orthodoxy. And part of the liturgy on the Sunday of the Triumph of Orthodoxy for most of the Eastern churches is a reading of the anathemas and kind of a celebrating that we have not fallen under these anathemas. Not all of them do that, but most of them do. In the Western Church, what happens is that the Pope approves of the council. Remember, he's only got 2 bishops there. He didn't go himself. He has the sessions translated into Latin, but it's not accepted as ecumenical in the West, not yet. Now, Price says it doesn't really get officially accepted until the early period of the Crusades, which is after East and West have split. And it seems from, or I should say, the articles that quote Price say that this is what Price says, because I didn't have Price's stuff accessible to me in that week's worth of revising my studies on this. Incidentally, I had taught through the 7 councils about 7 years ago, and this is the one I had to revise the most because it's just new information is always hard to get. Yeah, and Price, or the sources that were quoting Price, are saying that it might be the reason why this doesn't get accepted in the West until the early Crusades is they needed the Eastern church's help in fighting the Muslims. And so we're going to throw them a bone, especially since by then the West was certainly using images anyway, even if they hadn't accepted this. But before all that, in 794, so less than 10 years after this council, the Emperor Charlemagne and the French church, the Frankish church, they hold the Council of Frankfurt, 794, and they completely reject this council. There was a series of books that we call today the Libri Carolini, Charlemagne's books, which were a systematic refutation of the council. Now remember, they're basing it off of that Latin translation that they got from the Pope. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not, we don't know. And that the Council of Frankfurt and the Libri Carolini very much influenced the Protestants, especially the Reformed, at the time of the Reformation and in the few generations following. Calvin, for example, quotes from this pretty extensively in the Institutes. But here's the main issue for the Franks. They looked at this distinction being made between different kinds of proskynesis, and they're like, you're not actually doing that. You know, you might say there's a difference, but when we see you guys at prayer, you're not making a difference. This is a distinction without a difference, is what they're saying. And because the Franks, they were not, these late 8th century Franks, they were not iconoclasts. They had images, but they were also not iconoduals. They didn't have a problem with images as images, but they thought using them in veneration was either superstitious or idolatrous. That's what the Franks thought. That was their conclusion. And some of that is based on, hey, we're watching the way you do this, and it doesn't look any different to us. Does that sound familiar? That's often the way that the Protestant reasoning when talking about Roman Catholic use of images to this day. The Roman Catholics would argue the point, but from the outside, that's a lot of times what it looks like. That Ave Maria really sounds like you're worshiping the Virgin Mary, for example, in the eyes of a lot of Protestants. So the West is at a complete impasse over this until the late 9th century. But again, they don't receive fully the council as ecumenical until the Crusades, or they don't receive it until the Crusades kind of officially. And then it's not mentioned ecumenically in a council that the West considered ecumenically. And by West at this point, we do mean the Roman Church. Until the Council of Trent. That's after the Reformation. So you see the problem, some of the problems we have with this historically, why it's still hotly debated. I've got a few resources if you want to read some of that that I have in your link. I will put another one before we get to next week. Next week we'll talk about how this works for us as Anglicans and Protestants in general, but Anglicans in particular. And we're going to look at also, if we have time next week, on the back of your page, you have what the ACNA Catechism says on the second commandment. You may notice that we skip from, actually, there is a skip in that list. Where am I skipping things? Yeah, 276 and 277. Those are basically looking at how, the question for 276 is, how did Israel break the first two commandments? Why did the nations make such images? That's not super relevant for this particular discussion, and I couldn't fit it all in the paper if I included them. I may make a new paper next week and see if I can squeeze them in. But that's what we're going to do next week. We've got like 2 minutes before we get into anything else. Comments, questions. This was a straight up lecture for the most part. I don't usually like to do it that way, but that's why this is splitting into 2 classes.
So the people that rejected the icon, some of them were bound to have some mosaics. How did they do that?
So that historical issue, I'm not 100% sure, John. So a lot of times the iconoclasts would not have had anything in their own churches. They would have gone into other people's churches to break them. Or alternatively, it's kind of like when the Puritans were doing things in the Church of England, where they were whatever they could find and smash, they were smashing. That's my guess, but I don't know historically how you would handle, if there's mosaics up on the ceiling. I do know that when the Muslims took over certain Greek churches, when they were occupying parts of Greece, southern Greece, the Turks really, they just whitewashed over them. They just painted over those mosaics a lot of times in the frescoes and things like that. All right, well we will. Oh yeah, Randy. Yeah, some of those we might push to next week, but yeah. Yeah.
Latin and Greek, dealing with linguistic issues, Latin, Greek, and the East. But I was curious too, how we deal with people who are illiterate.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and we'll talk about some of that in application for next week, how you apply to reading the gospel to those that are illiterate today. But yeah, in terms of your other point, yeah, linguistic issues were increasingly a problem as we move on in this later period. Part of one of the reasons why, as Anglicans, we have kind of hedged our bets on councils 5 and 6 and 7 is historically that's where those linguistic issues become more of a problem. They're already beginning to become a problem in parts of the world at that time, where, for example, some of the folks in Egypt and Syria don't really know Greek as well anymore. So there is some talking past each other with that already, but it just gets worse and worse as the empire is in decline pretty much by this point. So yeah, there's just an increasing division, particularly East and West, but also within the East, parts of the East are kind of losing their connections to each other. All right, well, we're a little over time. We will pick up the rest of this next week. I may have a new handout or maybe not. Save the one you have either way. God bless you all.